My parents raised my rent to $1,500 on my 33rd birthday to bankroll my older brother's failing boutique fitness startup. They handed me an ultimatum right over a plate of cold pasta. Pay up or pack my bags by Friday. I did not cry or beg for their understanding. I simply dropped a crisp $100 bill on the table to cover my meal and walked away. What my family did not realize in their arrogance was that I was not just a girl crunching numbers at a desk. As a senior commercial real estate underwriter, I was about to become the lead executive holding the defaulted mortgage on my brother's business and the collateral tied to my parents' very own home. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who grossly underestimated your worth. My name is Elise, and for 3 years I lived in a cramped, unrenovated backyard guest house behind my parents' suburban home. It was supposed to be a temporary arrangement while I saved money and built my career in Austin, Texas. I paid my $800 in rent on time every single month, kept my head down, and endured the constant, subtle digs about my lifestyle. I thought I was being a responsible daughter, staying close to family, while securing my financial future. I had no idea my presence was viewed merely as a convenient revenue stream to be exploited whenever my brother needed a bailout. The reality of my position in the family hierarchy became undeniable on the evening of my 33rd birthday. We were sitting in a generic chain restaurant, the kind with sticky laminated menus and overhead lighting that casts a sickly yellow glow over everything. I had arrived straight from my office, wearing a modest blazer and slacks, expecting at least a token celebration, a small cake, a card perhaps, just a warm conversation. Instead, the atmosphere at the table was thick with an uncomfortable, calculating tension. My father Thomas sat across from me, his posture rigid and his expression entirely businesslike. Beside him was my mother Barbara, her eyes darting nervously between me and the restaurant entrance, as if she were anticipating a confrontation. And then there was Brandon. My older brother was 35, but he carried himself with the unearned swagger of a teenage trust fund heir. He slouched in the booth, casually swirling a seasonal craft beer in his glass. The sleeve of his expensive designer shirt was intentionally rolled up just enough to flash the heavy $5,000 Rolex on his wrist. He did not bother to wish me a happy birthday when I sat down. He merely gave me a tight, condescending nod. We ordered our food in relative silence. I tried to initiate small talk, asking my father about his week and my mother about her garden, but their responses were clipped and evasive. The server brought our meals, placing a plate of mediocre pasta in front of me. I picked up my fork, trying to ignore the sinking feeling in my chest. That was when my father cleared his throat, reached into the inner pocket of his jacket, and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He did not say a word at first. He just slid the printed document across the sticky table until it rested right next to my water glass. I stared at the paper, then up at his face. He looked entirely devoid of paternal warmth. I set down my fork and picked up the document. It was a new lease agreement for the backyard guest house. I scanned the text, assuming it was just a formality for the upcoming year. But then my eyes caught the bolded numbers under the monthly payment section. The rent had been changed from $800 to $1,500. I read the number 3 times to make sure my eyes were not deceiving me. A near doubling of my rent for a drafty one-bedroom unit with outdated plumbing and a leaking roof. I reminded him that we had a verbal agreement regarding the current rate, and that $1,500 was well above the market value for a converted shed in their backyard. Before my father could even open his mouth to respond, my mother jumped in. Barbara leaned forward, her voice loud enough to turn the heads of diners at the neighboring tables. She declared that they had to make some difficult financial adjustments. She pointed a manicured finger toward my brother and proudly announced that Brandon's luxury boutique fitness startup was experiencing a slow quarter. According to her, the economy was tough on visionary entrepreneurs, and his business required an immediate cash injection to stay afloat. They needed to maximize the income from their property to help him through this temporary rough patch. I turned my gaze to Brandon. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his craft beer, completely unbothered by the fact that our parents were extorting his sister to fund his failing venture. He did not look like a man struggling with a slow quarter. He looked like a man who was entirely accustomed to having his messes cleaned up by someone else. The sheer audacity of wearing a $5,000 watch while silently demanding that I surrender nearly double my rent to subsidize his lifestyle made my blood boil. He offered no apology, no explanation, just that same infuriating entitled smirk. I tried to keep my voice level as I pointed out the absurdity of the situation. I asked my mother why I was being penalized to fund Brandon's business. That was all it took for her to drop the facade of polite negotiation and launch into a full-blown attack. Barbara's face flushed with anger as she leaned across the table, weaponizing every detail of my life against me. She stated that I was single, that I just crunched numbers at a desk all day, and that I had no real responsibilities in life. Her words were sharp and deliberate, designed to minimize my existence. She waved a hand toward my brother, declaring that Brandon was building a legacy. He was an innovator, a creator, a man taking risks to build a real future. Then came the final crushing blow. My mother looked me dead in the eyes on my 33rd birthday and delivered the ultimatum. She told me to sign the contract and pay the $1,500 or pack my bags and be out of the guest house by Friday. She was speaking to me not as a daughter, but as a stubborn tenant standing in the way of her golden child's success. Sitting in that booth, staring at the predatory contract they had presented as a birthday gift, something fundamental inside me shifted. The desperate need for their validation simply evaporated. It was replaced by a cold, crystal-clear realization. I could not negotiate with people who did not respect me. I could not earn love that was entirely conditional on my willingness to be exploited. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I did not offer a single tear for them to feed on. I reached into my purse, pulled out my wallet, and extracted a crisp $100 bill. I placed it gently on top of the folded contract to cover the cost of my birthday dinner. I looked my mother directly in the eyes, silently signaling that I was done playing the victim. Without a word, I stood up from the booth. My sudden movement caused the heavy wooden table to shift slightly. The water glasses rattled, sending a small ripple across the surface. Brandon let out a loud, dramatic sigh of frustration. He leaned back against the vinyl upholstery and crossed his arms over his expensive designer shirt. He rolled his eyes as if my refusal to be extorted was a massive inconvenience to his evening. He sneered that this was exactly like the time I refused to let him borrow my car for a crucial investor meeting. According to his distorted version of reality, I had single-handedly ruined his pitch that day by forcing him to take a rideshare like a commoner. I remembered that particular day perfectly. My car was a reliable but modest sedan that I desperately needed to get to my actual paying job. Furthermore, he had a suspended license from months of unpaid parking tickets and reckless driving citations. Giving him the keys would have been a massive legal and financial liability. But in our family dynamic, his failures and shortcomings were always framed as my fault. I was supposed to be the eternal safety net for his reckless behavior. I looked down at my older brother. I did not raise my voice or show any trace of the anger burning deep within my chest. I simply looked at him, and then at my parents, who were staring at me in stunned silence. The power dynamic in the room was actively shifting, but they were too arrogant to realize it. I told them with absolute quiet certainty that I would be out of the guest house by midnight. My mother gasped loudly, her hand flying to her chest in a theatrical display of shock. She demanded to know where I thought I was going to go at this hour of the night. She warned me that I was making a terrible mistake and that walking away from family over a simple rent adjustment was a sign of deep emotional instability. She insisted that the housing market in Austin was entirely too aggressive for someone in my financial bracket. I ignored her completely. I turned my back on the three of them and began walking toward the front entrance of the restaurant. Behind me, I heard the harsh scrape of wood against tile as Brandon scrambled abruptly out of the booth. He refused to let me have the last word. He shouted across the crowded dining room, ensuring every single patron in the vicinity could hear his parting insult. He wished me good luck finding a place in this market with my dead-end job. A few heads turned in my direction, but I did not falter. I kept my posture perfectly straight and my pace steady. I pushed open the heavy glass doors of the restaurant and stepped out into the cool evening air. I did not look back. I did not hesitate for even a fraction of a second. The sound of his mocking laughter faded as the doors swung shut behind me, cutting off the noise of the dining room and leaving me in the quiet sanctuary of the parking lot. I walked to my car, a practical but pristine vehicle that I owned outright. I unlocked the doors, slid into the driver's seat, and closed the door securely against the outside world. The silence inside the cabin was absolute and deeply comforting. For a long moment, I just sat there, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, while I processed what had just transpired. A normal person might have broken down in tears after being evicted by their own parents on their birthday. They might have felt a crushing sense of rejection or questioned their own self-worth. But I felt nothing but a profound, overwhelming sense of relief washing over me. The heavy, suffocating burden of trying to be a good daughter to people who only saw me as a disposable resource had finally been lifted. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone. I opened my banking application and logged in, allowing the bright screen to illuminate the dark interior of my car. I bypassed the standard checking account where I kept my daily spending money to maintain appearances. Instead, I navigated directly to my primary savings and investment portfolio. The screen displayed a liquid balance of $450,000. My family genuinely believed I was a low-level clerk struggling to get by on a meager salary. They thought my quiet demeanor and modest lifestyle were clear signs of professional failure and persistent financial anxiety. They had absolutely no idea that I was a senior commercial real estate underwriter for Vanguard Equity. It was one of the most ruthless and wildly successful private equity firms in the entire state of Texas. I managed distressed portfolios worth hundreds of millions of dollars on a daily basis. I negotiated complex commercial acquisitions, analyzed high-risk debt structures, and made executive decisions that shaped the economic landscape of major cities. My compensation directly reflected the massive magnitude of my responsibilities. I made 3 times what my parents assumed I did. Because I had lived so far below my means, I had spent the last several years quietly and aggressively saving and investing every surplus dollar. I stared at the glowing green numbers on my screen. This was my secret weapon. This was the impenetrable financial armor I had built while my brother was busy leasing luxury sports cars and pretending to be a business mogul on social media. I took a deep, calming breath and locked my phone. I started the engine, pulled out of the restaurant parking lot, and drove directly toward the suburban neighborhood where my parents lived. When I pulled onto their manicured street, I noticed the lights were still completely off in the main house. They had likely stayed at the restaurant to finish their drinks and complained to each other about my incredibly dramatic exit. Their predictable behavior gave me the perfect window of opportunity. I drove past their massive front driveway and navigated the narrow alleyway parking directly behind the backyard guest house, out of sight from the main street. I unlocked the door of the tiny residential unit that had been my home for the past 3 years. The drafty windows and outdated plumbing suddenly felt completely intolerable, now that the illusion of family loyalty had been shattered entirely. I turned on the overhead light, revealing the peeling linoleum floors and the cramped living space. I did not have much to pack. I had always lived minimally, knowing subconsciously that this arrangement was temporary and highly conditional. I went straight to the kitchen and grabbed a box of heavy-duty black garbage bags from under the sink. I moved into the bedroom and started stripping the closet with ruthless speed. I pulled my professional clothes from the rack, leaving them on their wooden hangers, and dropped them directly into the bags. I folded my casual wear and tossed it in alongside my expensive designer shoes, which I had always hidden at the back of the wardrobe. I moved with a cold, calculated, mechanical efficiency. I left behind the cheap furniture, deciding it was not worth the effort. The entire process took less than 3 hours. I carried the heavy bags out to my car. I left the guest house keys on the kitchen counter, completely severing my physical tie. I spent that first night in a luxury hotel downtown, sleeping better than I had in years. By 9 o'clock the next morning, I was sitting in the leasing office of one of the most exclusive high-rise residential buildings in Austin. The property manager barely glanced at my application before approving it. My credit score was immaculate, and my verified income was more than enough to secure their premier penthouse unit. I signed the lease without a second thought. Walking into my new home for the first time was a revelation. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the city skyline. The hardwood floors gleamed under modern recessed lighting, and the kitchen featured sweeping quartz countertops that made my old laminate surfaces feel like a distant bad memory. The building itself was a fortress. It had 24-hour concierge service, biometric access points, and a secure underground parking garage. Nobody could simply drop by unannounced. For the first time in my adult life, I was entirely safe from unexpected family intrusions. Over the next few days, I furnished the space beautifully. I ordered plush, minimalist furniture, modern art pieces, and a massive king-sized bed. I spared no expense creating an environment that reflected my actual success rather than the manufactured poverty my parents had forced upon me. I arranged delivery and installation during my lunch breaks, returning each evening to a home that felt increasingly like a sanctuary. I kept this luxurious new reality completely hidden. I did not post photos on social media. I did not update my address on any shared family platforms. As far as my parents were concerned, I had vanished into the ether of the Austin rental market, likely struggling to find a cheap apartment that would accept my allegedly meager income. I settled into my new routine with a sense of profound peace, but I knew the silence from my family would not last. They needed a scapegoat to justify their own failures, and my sudden absence had deprived them of their favorite target. Exactly 1 week after my birthday dinner, the inevitable storm finally made landfall. I was sitting on my velvet sofa, enjoying a cup of artisan coffee, when my phone began to vibrate relentlessly against the glass coffee table. Notifications flooded my screen in rapid succession. I picked up the device and watched as text messages poured in from aunts, uncles, and cousins I rarely spoke to. The tone of every single message was laced with deep disappointment and aggressive self-righteousness. I opened a lengthy text from my Aunt Susan, my mother's younger sister. She demanded to know how I could be so incredibly selfish. According to her message, Barbara had spent the entire weekend calling every branch of the extended family in tears. My mother had orchestrated a vicious, highly calculated smear campaign to control the narrative of my departure. She completely omitted the fact that they had tried to extort me for nearly double my rent. Instead, Barbara spun a tragic tale about how they had generously subsidized my living expenses for years out of pity for my failing career. She told the entire family that when they respectfully asked me to contribute just a tiny bit more to help the family during a temporary financial crisis, I had thrown a massive temper tantrum and abandoned them. Barbara painted me as a financially unstable deadbeat who was actively dodging my familial obligations. She claimed I was running away because I was too lazy to support the people who had given me everything. I scrolled through the subsequent messages from my cousins. They were even more vitriolic and deeply insulting. My cousin David accused me of being pathologically jealous of Brandon's entrepreneurial spirit. He texted that I was just bitter because Brandon was out taking massive risks and building a real corporate legacy, while I was stuck pushing paper at a boring desk job. Another cousin told me I should be utterly ashamed of myself for leaving my parents high and dry when Brandon was on the verge of a massive business breakthrough. It was a masterclass in gaslighting and emotional manipulation. A younger version of myself would have panicked under the immense weight of their collective disapproval. The old Elise would have immediately drafted long, frantic paragraphs explaining the truth about the $1,500 rent demand. I would have sent screenshots of my bank account to prove my financial stability. I would have desperately pleaded with them to see my side of the story and recognize my parents' cruelty. But sitting in my quiet, secure penthouse, looking out over the waking city, I felt no desire whatsoever to defend myself. I realized that arguing with them would only feed the toxic drama they so desperately craved. Defending myself would require showing them my cards and giving them access to my actual reality. I chose absolute strategic silence instead. I did not type a single word in response. I did not answer any of the incoming phone calls. I simply sat back and let them aggressively spin their web of lies. Their frantic messages were not about seeking the truth. They were about demanding my compliance and punishing me for stepping out of line. Every unanswered text was a confirmation of my new boundary. Let them believe I was broke. Let them believe I was a jealous, bitter failure. Their distorted perception of me was their problem, not mine. The silence on my end clearly infuriated my immediate family, who were entirely used to me buckling under their coordinated pressure. Late that evening, the relentless notifications finally slowed down, replaced by a single incoming phone call from my father. I watched his name flash on the brightly lit screen until it automatically forwarded to voicemail. A minute later, a new audio message appeared in my inbox. I tapped the screen and pressed play, holding the phone to my ear as I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows of my living room. Thomas did not bother with a standard greeting. His voice was thick with unhinged rage and authoritarian entitlement. He stated that since I had cowardly refused to answer my phone, he was officially putting me on notice. He claimed that moving out in the middle of the night constituted a formal breach of my verbal lease agreement for the guest house. He demanded that I immediately transfer $3,000 to his bank account to cover the sudden loss of rental income and alleged property damages he was entirely fabricating. He warned me that if the money was not deposited by the end of the business week, he would be taking me directly to small claims court to force my compliance. He ended the voice message by aggressively threatening to garnish my wages at whatever dead-end company I was currently working for, making sure to emphasize how easily he could ruin my meager professional life. I listened to the entire threatening message without a single flinch. The sheer audacity of a man trying to extort $3,000 from a daughter he had just evicted was almost comical. I deleted the voicemail, permanently locked my cellular phone, and calmly walked into my gorgeous designer kitchen to pour myself a large glass of expensive red wine. I was not worried about his completely empty legal threats. I had much larger and far more important financial matters to handle. The very next morning, I walked into my corner office at Vanguard Equity and left my father's ridiculous voicemail where it belonged, outside the walls of my professional life. The glass tower rose above downtown Austin, all clean lines, polished stone, and controlled silence. Inside that building, no one treated me like a disposable daughter or a failed office clerk. My judgment carried weight. My signature moved capital. I had barely placed my briefcase beside my desk when my encrypted calendar flashed with an emergency summons from the managing director. 10 minutes later, the senior acquisition team was gathered around the long mahogany table in the main boardroom. Our managing director entered, carrying a thick gray file box, and set it down with enough force to make the water glasses tremble. A struggling regional Texas bank had spent months trying to stabilize its balance sheet. Overnight, Vanguard Equity had quietly purchased one of its largest portfolios of distressed commercial loans at a steep discount. The package contained restaurants, warehouses, medical offices, small retail centers, and several highly leveraged specialty businesses scattered across central Texas. Some borrowers could recover with disciplined restructuring. Others were already dead enterprises being kept upright by extensions, personal guarantees, and denial. Vanguard had not bought the portfolio to offer sympathy. We had bought it because correctly managed distress could be extremely profitable. The managing director assigned me lead authority over the first stage underwriting review. My responsibility was to audit every major account, classify the collateral, identify legal weaknesses, and recommend whether Vanguard should restructure, sell, or liquidate each position. The assignment was the largest independent portfolio I had handled. It was also the kind of work my family dismissed whenever they said I merely pushed numbers across a screen. I listened without interrupting, as legal counsel explained the transfer documents and servicing restrictions. Then I carried the master file back to my office, closed the glass door, and logged into the secure debt management system. The portfolio opened as a vast digital ledger. Each account was marked with delinquency periods, payment histories, collateral values, guarantor information, covenant violations, and internal risk grades inherited from the regional bank. I began with the highest risk tier because those files could expose Vanguard to the fastest losses. I sorted the ledger by days past due, then by debt service coverage and collateral impairment. The first row moved to the top of the screen. For several seconds, I assumed my mind had supplied a familiar name where none existed. Then I read it again. Apex Elite Fitness. The legal borrower was Apex Elite Fitness Holdings, LLC. The operating address matched Brandon's luxury boutique gym. The principal guarantor was my older brother. The company my mother had praised as a thriving legacy was listed as one of the most dangerous assets in the entire acquisition. Its commercial mortgage was 120 days past due. Several prior payment promises had been broken. Late charges and default interest were compounding every day. The regional bank had already classified the loan as non-performing and had included it in the sale because its own workout department no longer believed Brandon could cure the default. I remained completely still, but my heartbeat became louder in the quiet office. This was not a social media rumor or a family argument. It was a legally transferred debt file sitting under my professional authority. I opened the account summary and reviewed the chain of notes amendments and forbearance agreements. Brandon had repeatedly claimed temporary cash flow disruptions, delayed investor funding, and seasonal membership fluctuations. Each explanation had bought him time. None had produced sustained payments. The loan balance penalties and related obligations had climbed past $1 million, and the underlying business valuation had deteriorated every quarter. Then I opened the collateral schedule. The fitness center property was not the only asset securing the debt. The original lender had demanded additional protection after Brandon missed early performance targets. Thomas and Barbara had signed a personal guarantee and pledged their primary residence as supplemental collateral. Their suburban home, the house with the custom oak doors and manicured lawn, was legally tied to Apex Elite Fitness. The documents contained both of their notarized signatures. An attached appraisal showed that the lender had relied heavily on their remaining home equity when it approved later modifications. If the commercial default was enforced, the claim could extend directly to the property where they had raised me and where they had ordered me to leave. I pulled the guarantee documents onto a second monitor and checked them line by line. There was no obvious clerical error, missing signature, or expired lien. The cross-collateralization language was broad and deliberate. A default by Apex triggered remedies against the commercial property Brandon's pledged assets and my parents' residence. The regional bank had sent repeated notices to all guarantors. Delivery records showed that someone at my parents' address had signed for them. They had known the risk, at least on paper, while telling me Brandon merely needed a small cash injection after a slow quarter. The contrast was almost impossible to absorb. One evening earlier, my father had threatened to garnish my wages, over $3,000 in imaginary damages. Now I was looking at documents showing that he and my mother had exposed their home to more than $1 million of failing commercial debt. They had tried to double my rent not because I was an irresponsible tenant, but because the financial structure beneath their lives was already collapsing. My $800 had not been enough. $1,500 would not have been enough either. They were attempting to pour my income into a breach large enough to swallow their entire retirement. I did not celebrate the discovery. I did not immediately call anyone or use the information as a weapon. I was still bound by professional duties, confidentiality rules, and the standards that had built my career. I created a restricted audit folder, documented my family connection for the internal conflict log, and requested written clearance from compliance before proceeding. The managing director and general counsel reviewed the disclosure. Because I had no ownership interest in the borrower, and because every recommendation would be independently reviewed, they authorized me to continue as lead underwriter. My work would be judged on the evidence, not on my relationship to the guarantors. With that protection in place, I returned to the account. I downloaded the full payment history, tax returns, financial statements, vendor aging reports, bank records, credit applications, and every document Brandon had submitted to support his repeated requests for leniency. The screen filled with thousands of pages. Somewhere inside those records was the answer to a question my family had never bothered to ask. Was Apex Elite Fitness truly a viable company suffering a temporary setback? Or was the entire legacy nothing more than an expensive performance? I locked my office door, silenced my phone, and began the audit. By the time the first set of figures aligned across my monitors, I understood that the birthday ambush had been only the smallest visible symptom of a financial disaster far worse than anything my parents had admitted. For the first time, their private contempt and my professional authority had collided inside the same file, leaving no room for comforting family illusions or convenient excuses anymore. The top line of the ledger had placed my brother's company directly in my hands, and the collateral schedule had placed my parents' home beside it. Armed with full legal clearance, I began dismantling the numbers behind Brandon's so-called legacy. I built a clean underwriting model from the raw records rather than relying on the glossy projections he had submitted to the regional bank. I separated recurring membership revenue from promotional discounts, removed one-time capital injections, normalized payroll, and matched every reported expense against actual bank activity. Within an hour, the picture became darker than the risk summary had suggested. Apex Elite Fitness had not produced a true operating profit in 24 consecutive months. The business was not enduring a temporary slow quarter. It had been structurally insolvent for 2 full years. Brandon's presentations claimed rapidly expanding membership, but the customer data showed constant churn. He attracted people with discounted introductory packages, counted them as long-term clients, and then ignored the cancellations that followed. Revenue rose briefly during promotional campaigns and collapsed as soon as the discounts ended. The high-end personal training program he advertised as the company's growth engine barely covered the commissions paid to instructors. Equipment leases, luxury finishes, premium software subscriptions, and oversized management salaries consumed nearly every dollar that entered the operating account. On paper, The gym looked fashionable. In financial reality, it was a machine designed to convert borrowed money into appearances. The debt structure was even worse. Whenever one lender became impatient, Brandon had borrowed from another. He used short-term merchant advances carrying punishing effective interest rates to make partial payments on the commercial mortgage. He opened business credit lines to service older business credit lines. Several withdrawals were timed within hours of incoming deposits, showing that he was moving cash between accounts simply to create the illusion of liquidity on reporting dates. The regional bank's internal notes documented repeated promises of investor capital that never arrived. Every extension had only allowed the deficit to grow larger. I traced the pattern backward and found the point where my parents had entered the collapse. 2 years earlier, after Apex missed its first major covenant, Thomas and Barbara refinanced their home and transferred a large portion of the proceeds into Brandon's company. 6 months later, they opened a second mortgage when payroll and rent fell behind. The third transaction was the most devastating. They had borrowed against nearly all remaining equity to satisfy a temporary cure agreement with the regional bank. The funds bought Brandon a few more months, but they did not improve the business. My parents had systematically exchanged decades of home ownership and retirement security for time inside a failing enterprise. The records also explained the urgency behind my birthday eviction. A payment from my parents had reached Apex 3 days before the dinner. Their checking balance afterward was dangerously low, while another commercial installment was due within weeks. Raising my rent by $700 would not have rescued the loan, but it would have provided them with a predictable stream they could redirect toward Brandon. They were not making a rational housing decision. They were searching every corner of the family for cash, and they had identified me as the easiest person to pressure. I opened the vendor aging report and compared it with the transfers from my parents. If their money had been used as promised, Apex should have caught up on equipment leases, instructor wages, utilities, insurance, and maintenance. Instead, the vendor balances continued to age. A flooring contractor had been waiting more than 90 days for payment. 2 fitness instructors had complained in writing about late payroll. The property insurer had issued a cancellation warning. A supplier had placed the business on prepaid terms because Brandon repeatedly missed invoices. Hundreds of thousands of dollars had entered the company, yet the obligations necessary to keep the doors open remained unpaid. That contradiction changed the nature of my review. Poor management could explain losses, but it could not explain money disappearing while every legitimate creditor waited. I created a transaction map and tagged every payment by merchant recipient and stated business purpose. I matched accounting labels against bank descriptions. Brandon's records were filled with vague categories such as strategic development, executive outreach, market expansion, and client acquisition. Those phrases appeared professional enough to survive a casual review, but they concealed where the cash had actually gone. I selected the largest entries and requested supporting invoices. Many had none. Others were backed by altered receipts or handwritten notes created weeks after the transaction. A supposed equipment acquisition had been paid to a luxury automobile finance company. A series of executive outreach charges matched hotel deposits and airline bookings. Transfers described as regional marketing support had moved into an account controlled solely by Brandon. The amounts were too consistent and too deliberate to be innocent bookkeeping mistakes. Someone had designed the classifications to disguise personal spending as operational necessity. I ran the data through Vanguard's forensic expense program. The software flagged repeated round-dollar transfers payments to related accounts, merchant codes inconsistent with the ledger descriptions, and unusual weekend activity. The alerts filled my screen faster than I could open them. I printed the exception report and spread the pages across my desk. Red warning symbols covered the document. Apex was not merely failing because memberships were weak. Capital had been deliberately diverted away from the business, while lenders, employees, vendors, and my parents were told that every new dollar would stabilize operations. For a moment, I imagined Barbara sitting at her kitchen table, signing the third mortgage, while Brandon assured her that success was 1/4 away. I imagined Thomas telling himself that risking the house proved faith in his son. Their favoritism had made them reckless, but the records suggested they did not understand the full scale of the theft. They had chosen to believe Brandon without demanding evidence, then punished me for refusing to join them. Their ignorance did not make them innocent. It showed how completely they had surrendered judgment to the child they preferred. My professional instincts took over. I preserved copies of every relevant record, documented the source of each transaction, and created a timeline linking family transfers, loan proceeds, missed payments, and personal withdrawals. I noted where evidence might require referral to federal regulators because some of the capital came from a government-backed lending program. I did not make accusations in the audit notes. I recorded facts, amounts, dates, and account destinations. The numbers were powerful precisely because they required no emotional interpretation. The deeper I went, the more the language of the family dinner returned to me. Brandon had called himself a builder while stripping value from each person who trusted him. My mother had called me selfish while offering him money she did not own. My father had called my career insignificant, yet the skills he mocked were the reason the fraud could be seen. Their judgments had been inverted from the beginning. By late afternoon, the structure of the deception was clear. Brandon had used debt to manufacture the image of growth, used my parents' home equity to delay default, and used false expense labels to keep funding his personal lifestyle. The company had become a shell surrounding a private spending account. I leaned closer to the final set of bank statements and isolated the transfers connected to the federally backed loan. The money my parents had bled themselves dry to provide was not keeping Apex Elite Fitness alive. It was financing something else entirely. I turned to federal loan records ready to trace every dollar through the accounts. I pulled up the primary operating account for Apex Elite Fitness and began tracing the exact path of the incoming capital. The initial funding had not just come from our regional bank. Brandon had also secured a small business administration loan designed to help struggling enterprises. That money was federally backed and specifically earmarked for payroll and essential operational costs. Instead of keeping his gym afloat, my brother had treated that government loan like his personal slush fund. I watched the digital paper trail weave through a complex web of transfers. He would move large sums from the business account into a secondary holding account and then funnel the cash directly into his personal checking. The absolute sheer audacity was completely staggering. He was committing federal wire fraud while crying poverty to our parents. I routed the most damning transactions to my secure office printer. The machine hummed quietly, spitting out page after page of undeniable evidence. I walked over and picked up the warm sheets, spreading them across my glass desk. I grabbed a red highlighter and began marking the specific line items that told the true story of his fabricated success. There was a recurring monthly automatic draft of $2,000 paying for the lease on his brand new Porsche. He had categorized the luxury vehicle expense as a mobile marketing asset. Below that, I found multiple charges totaling over $15,000 for first-class flights and luxury resort stays in Cabo San Lucas. He had brazenly written these trips off as client acquisition retreats. The hits just kept coming. I highlighted dozens of charges from the most expensive steakhouses in downtown Austin. Brandon was routinely dropping $1,000 a night on premium Wagyu beef and vintage wine. Every single one of these extravagant dinners was meticulously logged in his accounting software as networking events with potential investors. He was eating through our parents' retirement savings, just one expensive dinner at a time. I stared at the highlighted pages, feeling profound disgust. While I was living in a drafty guest house, carefully managing my budget and paying my own way, he was living like a billionaire on stolen money. He had mocked my practical car and modest clothes while secretly burning through federally backed loans and our parents' equity to maintain an illusion of wealth. The sheer volume of the theft was breathtaking, and it made the memory of my eviction even more sickening. I gathered the highlighted papers and placed them back into the thick physical file. I sat down heavily in my leather chair, the weight of the situation fully settling over me. I was no longer just an aggrieved sister looking at a selfish brother. I was the senior executive holding the absolute key to my family's financial existence. The cross-collateralization of the commercial loan meant that the fate of the fitness center and the fate of my parents' primary residence were inextricably bound together. I reviewed the original loan origination documents bearing my parents' signatures. Because my parents had blindly signed the guarantor agreements without demanding to see a single legitimate profit and loss statement, their massive suburban home was legally pledged against Brandon's mountain of fraudulent debt. They had trusted his lies over basic financial prudence, and now that blind faith was going to cost them everything. If Vanguard Equity moved forward with standard foreclosure proceedings to recoup the defaulted commercial loan, we would not just seize the fitness center. We would seize my parents' house. They would lose the sprawling colonial home they had lived in for 3 decades. They would lose the meticulously manicured lawn, the neighborhood prestige, and the comfortable retirement they had arrogantly boasted about. The bank would take everything they owned to satisfy the outstanding balance of my brother's catastrophic failures. They had tied their entire life to a sinking ship of fraud, and they had absolutely no idea the hull was already completely underwater. I looked out the window at the bright Texas sky, considering my options. As the lead underwriter on the portfolio, I had the power to intervene. I could easily draft a generous restructuring plan. I could extend their payment terms, lower their interest rates, and give Brandon a grace period to liquidate his personal assets and attempt to make the account current. I could save my parents from the humiliating reality of losing their home. I could be the dutiful daughter they had always demanded I be, swooping in to clean up the mess and protect the sacred family image. But doing so would mean absorbing the cost of their cruelty. It would mean validating their belief that Brandon was a genius who just needed a little more help and that I was nothing more than a convenient safety net. I thought back to the birthday dinner. I remembered the cold contempt in my mother's voice when she told me to pack my bags. I remembered the arrogant smirk on my brother's face as he sat there, wearing a watch bought with stolen money. They had been willing to throw me out on the street to protect this illusion. My office phone suddenly rang loudly, pulling me sharply from my thoughts. It was the managing director explicitly requesting an immediate status update on the newly acquired distressed debt portfolio. I gathered my thick files and walked deliberately down the long, carpeted hallway directly to his massive corner suite. I took a seat across from his desk, placing the heavy stack of manila folders right in front of me. I maintained a perfectly neutral, highly professional expression as I began my verbal report. I simply presented the cold, hard financial data, clearly outlining the extreme risk assessment for the absolute highest tier of defaulted accounts. My boss listened intently as I walked him through the numbers. I explained the severity of the delinquencies, the fraudulent categorization of expenses I had uncovered, and the absolute lack of viable revenue streams in the worst-performing assets. I kept my voice clinical and detached, embodying the ruthless efficiency Vanguard Equity demanded. When I finished my presentation, he nodded slowly, his expression incredibly serious and entirely focused on the bottom line. He leaned forward and gave me his executive directive. He told me I had the green light to offer restructuring deals to any businesses that showed genuine potential for recovery. If an enterprise could be salvaged through modified terms, I was authorized to negotiate. But for the terminal accounts, the ones bleeding capital with absolutely no hope of profitability, He wanted aggressive, immediate action. He instructed me to move forward with absolute foreclosure on the worst offenders to mitigate our firm's financial exposure. There would be no leniency for borrowers who were actively defaulting while demonstrating zero operational viability. I walked back to my office with his authorization echoing in my mind. I closed the glass door behind me and sat back down at my desk. The master ledger was still open on my computer screen, with Apex Elite Fitness glowing at the very top of the liquidation list. I placed my hands on my keyboard. The final decision was entirely mine to make. I had to choose whether to secretly save the cruel family that had so casually discarded me, or to flawlessly execute my professional job and simply let the natural, devastating consequences of their own terrible actions permanently crush them. I looked closely at the undeniable evidence of my brother's massive theft. My cellular phone vibrated softly against the polished glass surface of my desk, pulling my attention away from the glaring spreadsheets. It was a notification from a popular social media application. I had not blocked my family members on any digital platforms because maintaining visual access to their public behavior provided valuable strategic intelligence. I unlocked the screen and opened the application to see what had triggered the alert. There was a brand new post from Brandon. He had uploaded a highly edited video tour of his boutique fitness center. He was wearing another incredibly expensive designer outfit and holding a premium protein shake in one hand. He spoke directly into the camera, boasting endlessly about his booming chief executive lifestyle. He confidently claimed that his company was currently experiencing unprecedented third-quarter growth. He told his thousands of followers that he was actively scouting new commercial locations for a massive statewide franchise expansion. It was a spectacular performance of complete and utter delusion. I watched him smile brightly at the camera while standing in a building that my private equity firm now legally controlled. He was recording his motivational entrepreneurial speech on a floor that was actively undergoing corporate foreclosure proceedings. The immense disconnect between his digital performance and his actual financial reality was absolutely staggering. A few hours later, another notification appeared on my device. This time it was from my mother. Barbara had reposted Brandon's promotional video directly to her own timeline. She made sure to specifically tag my personal account in the post, guaranteeing that I would receive a direct alert. She added a lengthy, aggressive caption designed specifically to humiliate me in front of our extended family and network of friends. She wrote that she was so incredibly proud of her son for truly understanding what real hustle looked like. She stated that true visionary entrepreneurs take massive, calculated risks to build lasting legacies for their families. Then, she added a deeply passive-aggressive concluding sentence clearly aimed at me. She wrote that some people will just be bitter employees forever grinding away at boring desk jobs because they lack the courage and the vision to achieve greatness. She was publicly celebrating the very same man who was actively draining her retirement accounts and jeopardizing the roof over her head. She was weaponizing his fabricated success to punish me for refusing to hand over $1,500 a month for a dilapidated guest house. I sat in my quiet, secure office and read her cruel words multiple times. A normal daughter might have felt a sharp pang of rejection or a desperate urge to correct the public narrative. But as I looked from her vicious social media post back to the glowing monitors displaying their catastrophic loan defaults, I felt something entirely different. The very last shred of familial guilt I had been harboring completely vanished. I had spent the entire morning wrestling with the heavy moral implications of liquidating my own parents. I had briefly wondered if perhaps I was being too ruthless, or if I owed them some sort of grace despite their terrible behavior. But seeing their continued arrogance and active cruelty washed all of that hesitation away in an instant. They were not helpless victims of a struggling regional economy. They were willing and eager participants in a toxic cycle of enabling and psychological abuse. They were drowning in a sea of secret, unmanageable debt, and their immediate response was to stand on the sinking deck and publicly mock the only person who possessed the power to throw them a lifeline. I locked my phone and placed it face down on my desk. I chose right then and there to let the natural, devastating consequences of their own actions play out without a single ounce of intervention on my part. I would not offer them a specialized restructuring deal. I would not grant them a temporary grace period to liquidate their personal assets and save their primary residence. I would treat their defaulted account with the exact same cold, clinical efficiency that Vanguard Equity demanded for any other terminally delinquent commercial property. They wanted me to be just a bitter employee processing paperwork at a desk. I decided to give them exactly what they asked for. I would be the anonymous corporate mechanism that dismantled their entire fraudulent existence. I opened the legal processing software on my secure terminal. I began the highly detailed, meticulous work of personally drafting the official notice of default. This was the preliminary legal warning that officially started the countdown clock on the property seizure. I carefully populated the required fields with the outstanding balance figures, the accumulated penalty fees, and the precise legal descriptions of both the commercial fitness center and my parents' suburban home. I cross-referenced every single data point against the original loan origination documents to ensure there were absolutely no administrative errors. A single mistake could grant them a procedural delay, and I was determined to make this execution completely flawless. Every keystroke felt like a definitive step toward my ultimate liberation. I verified the cross-collateralization clauses, verifying that the primary residence was legally bound to the failing fitness center without any possibility of severance. As I moved through the standardized legal forms, I reviewed the automatically generated signature blocks at the bottom of the intent to foreclose documents. Typically, these preliminary warning letters would include the name and direct contact information of the assigned portfolio manager, so the debtor could reach out to negotiate a settlement. I immediately deleted my personal information from the administrative fields. I routed all the contact parameters through the General Legal Compliance Department of Vanguard Equity. I ensured that my name was absolutely nowhere on any of the preliminary warning documents that would be sent to the business or to my parents' residence. When the certified letters arrived in their mailbox, they would see only the intimidating corporate letterhead of a massive private equity firm. They would have no idea that their estranged daughter had personally authorized the destruction of their fraudulent empire. I printed the final drafts of the foreclosure notices and arranged them perfectly on my desk. The crisp white paper represented the end of their decades-long charade. For years, I had watched my brother receive endless praise and financial bailouts while I was treated as a disposable afterthought. I had endured the relentless comparisons, the subtle insults, and the overt demands for my resources. Now, the tables had turned with spectacular finality. The documents sitting before me were not acts of revenge. They were simply the undeniable reality of mathematics and contract law. My family had built their entire identity on a foundation of lies and embezzlement, and the structural integrity of that foundation had finally failed. I placed the drafted documents into a sleek gray folder and handed them over to the internal processing team for final review and mailing. The physical act of handing over the file felt incredibly satisfying. I walked back into my office and looked out over the sprawling city landscape. My brother was likely filming another video, while my mother bragged about his leadership. They were completely oblivious that a certified letter was working its way through the postal system, carrying a financial death sentence. I sat down, fully ready to continue the job my mother had so arrogantly and completely dismissed. The interface of the legal processing software was cold and clinical. I navigated to the specialized document generation suite and began constructing the formal notice of default. This was not a standard template job. I manually reviewed every single cross-collateralization clause connecting the commercial property to my parents' residential deed. I wanted to guarantee that when the legal hammer finally fell, my brother would have absolutely no procedural loopholes to exploit. I spent 3 hours verifying the exact municipal codes and state statutes regarding commercial foreclosure timelines in Texas. I attached the comprehensive ledger of his missed payments, the evidence of the unauthorized diversion of small business administration funds, and the exhausted grace periods from the previous regional bank. I made sure the language was impenetrable. I drafted a secondary commercial lien execution, linking his personal assets directly to the corporate deficit. Any competent corporate attorney looking at this file would immediately tell Brandon that he had absolutely no legal recourse. He was entirely boxed in by his own fraudulent signatures and terrible financial decisions. The trap I was building was completely airtight. I double-checked the compliance parameters, ensuring that our firm was protected from any potential counter-litigation. Every single piece of evidence was meticulously logged and verified against state banking regulations. The beauty of the corporate debt acquisition process is its absolute anonymity. When Vanguard Equity purchased the massive portfolio of distressed loans from the failing regional bank, the transition of ownership was executed as a silent back-end transfer. The original lending institution quietly handed over the deeds and promissory notes without making any grand public announcements to the borrowers. My brother and my parents had absolutely no idea that their massive debt had been sold to a ruthless private equity firm. More importantly, they had no idea that their estranged daughter was the senior executive assigned to hold their mortgage. As far as Brandon was concerned, he was still dealing with the same regional bank executives he had been dodging and manipulating for the past 2 years. He likely assumed that his local connections and charismatic excuses would continue to grant him infinite extensions. He had spent his entire life talking his way out of consequences, so he naturally believed this situation would be no different. The massive corporate machine moving against him was completely invisible from his vantage point. He thought he was playing a game he could win by simply ignoring the rules. I initiated the automated warning sequence within our servicing portal. Vanguard Equity compliance protocols required us to send a formal 30-day right to cure notice before filing the final foreclosure execution. The system generated a highly intimidating certified letter outlining the severity of the delinquency and demanding immediate payment in full. I tracked the delivery confirmation through the Postal Service interface. The notification showed that the certified envelope was successfully delivered and signed for by a receptionist at Apex Elite Fitness. I waited to see what his response would be. A normal business owner facing a catastrophic corporate default would immediately contact the legal department to beg for a restructuring plan. They would hire a financial advisor or attempt to liquidate personal assets to save their enterprise. Brandon did absolutely nothing. The 30-day cure period began to slowly tick away. I monitored the incoming communications log every single morning. There were no phone calls to our legal department. There were no desperate emails pleading for an extension. There was no sudden influx of capital to the holding account. My brother simply ignored the severe corporate warning. He clearly believed it was just another empty threat from a toothless regional lender. His staggering arrogance blinded him to the rapidly approaching financial execution. I watched his social media accounts for any sign of panic, but he only increased his volume of boastful entrepreneurial posts. The days turned into weeks. I settled into a comfortable routine in my new downtown penthouse, enjoying the peace and quiet of my luxurious independence. I drank artisan coffee on my balcony every morning, watching the city wake up, and went to my high-paying job where my expertise was actually respected. The contrast between my serene reality and the chaotic financial collapse heading toward my family was profound. I felt a deep sense of satisfaction, knowing that my success was entirely self-made and legally secure. I watched the countdown clock on my work terminal steadily approach 0. Every day that passed without a response from Brandon was another nail in his corporate coffin. My parents continued their aggressive silence, likely waiting for me to come crawling back with a rent check and an apology. They were completely unaware that the countdown was ticking down on their primary residence as well. Their beautiful suburban home was legally tethered to Brandon's sinking ship, and the water was rising fast. I felt no urge to warn them. They had dug this grave together. As the final week of the 30-day cure period approached, I stopped by the secure mailroom in the lobby of my residential building. The concierge greeted me warmly and handed me a small stack of correspondence. Mixed in with the standard corporate catalogs and premium magazines was a thick, heavy envelope. The paper stock was incredibly expensive textured and slightly shimmering. I turned the envelope over and saw my name printed in elegant calligraphy. The return address was printed in a stylish modern font that I instantly recognized as the branding for Apex Elite Fitness. I rode the private elevator up to my penthouse and walked into my spacious kitchen. I set my designer briefcase on the quartz island and reached for a stainless steel letter opener. I carefully sliced through the thick paper and pulled out the contents. It was a wildly arrogant, gold-embossed invitation. Brandon was hosting what he called a Series B investor gala at his fitness center. The heavy cardstock advertised an exclusive evening of high-level networking and elite investment opportunities. He was throwing a party to attract local millionaires, promising them ground-floor access to his fictional statewide expansion. The sheer volume of money spent just on the invitations alone was an insult to the massive debt he was currently ignoring. A small piece of personalized stationery fluttered out of the envelope and landed on my countertop. I recognized my brother's messy handwriting immediately. He had written a direct personal note to me. He told me to come see what a real career looks like. He added that the craft drinks at the venue were $15, so I needed to make sure I brought my debit card. He warned me not to embarrass the family by wearing cheap clothes or talking about my boring office job. I stared at the handwritten insult and let out a soft, genuine laugh. The absolute sheer delusion was staggering. He was throwing a lavish catered party to beg local business owners for a bailout while completely ignoring the certified foreclosure notices stacking up on his desk. He was using what little stolen money he had left to fund a glamorous facade. He was inviting me to witness his fake empire just days before I was scheduled to legally seize the very building he was standing in. I placed the gold-embossed invitation right next to my laptop. It was the perfect opportunity. I would attend his magnificent gala, and I would bring my briefcase full of reality. I picked up the small, elegantly embossed response card that had fallen onto my kitchen island alongside the invitation from earlier that day. The thick paper offered a choice of checkboxes to confirm my attendance and dietary preferences for the lavish catered event. I did not even bother to find a pen. I simply carried the expensive cardstock over to my stainless steel trash receptacle and dropped it in. I would not be sending a formal reply. I wanted my arrival on Saturday night to be a complete surprise. The next morning, I walked into the Vanguard Equity offices with a renewed sense of absolute purpose. The 30-day cure period had officially expired over the weekend. My brother had failed to make a single payment or initiate any contact with our legal compliance department. The protective window granted by the state banking regulations was now entirely closed. It was time to initiate the final phase of the liquidation process. I scheduled an immediate and highly confidential meeting with our internal property seizure team. We gathered in one of the smaller, glass-walled conference rooms overlooking the bustling Austin streets. I handed over the verified default logs and instructed them to prepare the final execution of the commercial foreclosure. The senior legal counsel reviewed my meticulously prepared file and confirmed that there were absolutely no administrative hurdles remaining. I had the undisputed authority to select the exact date and time for the final transfer of ownership to be recorded at the county courthouse. I looked at the digital calendar displayed on the conference room monitor. I bypassed the immediate available dates and pointed directly to the Friday afternoon immediately preceding Brandon's extravagant investor gala. I instructed the legal team to file the final deed transfer and property seizure documents at exactly 4 o'clock on that specific Friday. By the time the courthouse closed for the weekend, Vanguard Equity would be the absolute, undisputed legal owner of the commercial property housing Apex Elite Fitness. My brother would be hosting his massive high society fundraising event in a building he no longer legally possessed. The legal team nodded in agreement, processing the execution order with their usual clinical detachment. To them, it was just another distressed asset being effectively neutralized to protect the firm's financial interests. They had absolutely no idea about the deeply personal family dynamics tied to that specific commercial address. I returned to my corner office and finalized the parallel execution orders for my parents' suburban residence. Because the loans were inextricably cross-collateralized, the foreclosure on the fitness center triggered the immediate default on their primary home. I signed the final authorizations with a steady hand and completely clear conscience. I felt no hesitation and no lingering sense of familial guilt. My mother had spent the entire week aggressively posting on her social media platforms about the upcoming gala. She was actively tagging local business influencers and boasting about how her visionary son was about to secure a massive round of expansion funding. She was entirely consumed by the illusion of their manufactured wealth, while completely ignoring the catastrophic financial reality she had co-signed. I monitored their digital footprint over the next few days, watching them dig their graves deeper with every passing hour. Brandon was uploading daily countdown videos from the gym floor, showing off the elaborate lighting rigs and premium catering stations he was having installed for the party. He was burning through the absolute last reserves of his fraudulently obtained capital to impress people he desperately needed to bail him out. He was standing on the precipice of absolute ruin and dancing for an audience of complete strangers. I maintained my total strategic silence. I did not reach out to warn them. I did not respond to the passive-aggressive text messages my mother occasionally sent to remind me of what I was missing. I focused entirely on my own preparations. I knew that when I walked into that venue on Saturday night, I could not look like the quiet, submissive daughter they were used to bullying. I could not arrive wearing the modest, conservative clothes I had always worn to our miserable family dinners. I needed to project the absolute, undeniable reality of my actual corporate success. I needed to look like the senior executive who literally owned the ground beneath their feet. On Thursday afternoon, I left the Vanguard Equity offices early and walked toward the most exclusive high-end retail district in downtown Austin. I bypassed the standard department stores and navigated directly to a luxury designer boutique known for its immaculate custom tailoring and premium European fabrics. The moment I stepped through the heavy glass doors, the atmosphere shifted into quiet, refined elegance. A personal stylist approached me immediately, recognizing a serious client. I told her exactly what I was looking for. I did not want anything flashy or unnecessarily ostentatious. I wanted sharp architectural lines and uncompromising authority. I wanted an outfit that commanded absolute respect the moment I entered a room. The stylist guided me to a private fitting suite and began pulling exclusive pieces from their imported collection. We spent 2 hours meticulously curating the perfect ensemble. I finally settled on a breathtaking, custom-tailored designer suit in a deep, striking shade of midnight blue. The fabric was a luxurious Italian wool and silk blend that draped flawlessly across my frame. The cut of the blazer was incredibly sharp, featuring structured shoulders and a tailored waist that projected pure corporate power. I paired the striking suit with a crisp, pristine white silk blouse and a pair of elegant stiletto heels. I stood in front of the massive 3-way mirror in the boutique fitting room and stared at my reflection. The transformation was truly profound. For 33 years, my family had systematically conditioned me to make myself as small and unnoticeable as possible. They had demanded that I shrink my ambitions and hide my intelligence so my brother could comfortably occupy the center of attention. They had actively mocked my appearance and dismissed my professional trajectory as a boring dead-end path. The woman looking back at me in the mirror was completely unrecognizable from the defeated sister they had cruelly evicted from a backyard guest house just a few short weeks ago. I looked wealthy. I looked formidable. I looked exactly like the ruthless senior private equity underwriter I had worked so hard to become. I handed the stylist my corporate credit card and paid for the ensemble without a second of hesitation. I purchased a structured leather briefcase to complete the professional aesthetic. It was not just an accessory. It was the physical vessel I would use to carry the finalized foreclosure notices directly into the heart of his fake empire. I carried the garment bags back to my penthouse and hung the immaculate suit in my walk-in closet. The final pieces of my strategy were perfectly in place. The legal execution was silently processing through the courthouse system, and my armor was ready. I spent Friday evening looking out over the glittering city skyline, feeling a deep sense of quiet anticipation. The sun set over the hills, marking the end of the business week and the official termination of my brother's ownership. Saturday night was rapidly approaching. The gala was in full swing, and I was fully prepared to walk through those doors and permanently end their pathetic charade. The remainder of that week moved with an agonizingly slow but deeply satisfying rhythm. Every time I looked at that ostentatious gold invitation resting on my kitchen counter, I felt a renewed surge of clarity. I did not need to prepare a speech or practice what I was going to say. The legal documents would do all the talking for me. I simply had to wait for the clock to run out. Thursday bled into Friday. Friday was the absolute deadline. I arrived at the Vanguard Equity offices earlier than usual. The morning air was crisp and the entire building felt charged with that quiet, focused energy that precedes a major financial execution. I sat at my desk and opened the master portfolio ledger. The timer on Brandon's account was literally down to its final hours. Texas commercial real estate law is incredibly rigid. Once that window expires, the transfer is a mechanical certainty. At exactly 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the deadline officially passed. I picked up my office phone and dialed the direct extension for our internal property seizure team. The senior legal counsel answered on the second ring. I gave the verbal authorization to file the final deed transfer and property seizure documents at the county courthouse. The process was entirely digital. Within minutes, the municipal records were updated. Vanguard Equity was now the absolute, undisputed legal owner of the commercial property housing Apex Elite Fitness. The building no longer belonged to my brother. The ground he stood on and the roof over his head were now corporate assets under my direct managerial control. But the legal execution did not stop at the commercial property line. Because of the ironclad cross-collateralization clauses my parents had foolishly signed, the default automatically triggered the secondary lien. Vanguard Equity now held the dominant legal claim on Thomas and Barbara's primary suburban residence. The house where I had grown up, the house where they had arrogantly told me I was a failure, was now effectively seized by the very firm I worked for. By the time the courthouse closed for the weekend, the financial destruction of my family was set in stone. I sat back in my ergonomic leather chair and let the reality of the moment wash over me. There were no alarms sounding in the city. There were no flashing red lights or dramatic sirens to warn them. The most devastating financial events rarely happen with a loud bang. They happen in absolute silence, through the electronic transfer of standardized PDF documents and the digital stamp of a county clerk. Because it was late Friday, the physical locks had not been changed. Security contractors were scheduled to arrive Monday morning. That gave my brother a 48-hour window of complete and utter ignorance. I opened my social media application to check his public feed. Brandon was currently broadcasting a live video from the main floor of the fitness center. He was enthusiastically directing a team of hired event planners who were busy setting up velvet ropes, premium lighting rigs, and expensive floral arrangements. He was practically vibrating with arrogant excitement. He looked directly into the camera lens and promised his followers that tomorrow night was going to change the entire fitness industry. He was blissfully unaware that he was trespassing in a building he no longer owned. He was pouring thousands of dollars of stolen money into a facility that was legally scheduled to have its glass doors chained shut in less than 3 days. I watched my mother comment on his live video, offering her usual sycophantic praise. She typed out a lengthy message saying how proud she was to see her brilliant son stepping into his true destiny as a business leader. She was sitting in a house that she technically no longer possessed, cheering for the exact man who had caused her to lose it. Their shared delusion was difficult to comprehend. I closed the application and focused my attention back on the physical tasks remaining on my desk. I pulled out the final stack of official eviction notices and foreclosure confirmations. These were not the preliminary warnings they had so carelessly ignored. These were terminal execution documents bearing fresh digital seals. I took my favorite fountain pen and signed the final pages of the internal processing forms, carefully verifying every single dollar amount and legal citation. The stack of paper was thick and heavy. It contained the complete forensic audit of Brandon's embezzlement, the undeniable records of the diverted Small Business Administration loans, and the final property transfer deeds. I stood up and walked over to the structured leather designer briefcase I had purchased earlier in the week. The briefcase was sleek, dark, and incredibly professional. I unclasped the polished metal hardware and gently placed the catastrophic stack of legal documents inside. I secured the closure, feeling the solid, satisfying weight of the case in my hand. This was the exact weapon I had been quietly forging for weeks. It was loaded with undeniable mathematical truth and fully ready to be deployed. I left my office, turning off the overhead lights, and walked out to my car. Saturday arrived with a cool, crisp breeze that cut through the usual Texas heat. I spent the entire day in a state of absolute calm. I went for a long run along the riverfront, drank an expensive green juice, and took my time preparing for the evening ahead. When the sun finally began to set, I walked into my massive walk-in closet and retrieved the custom-tailored midnight blue designer suit. I dressed with meticulous care. The Italian wool and silk blend draped perfectly over my frame, creating a silhouette of pure, uncompromising authority. I stepped into my elegant stiletto heels and checked my reflection in the full-length mirror. I did not look like the quiet, submissive daughter who had accepted their scraps and insults for over 3 decades. I looked like the senior executive who was about to dismantle their entire world. I grabbed my briefcase and my car keys. I drove through the glittering downtown streets, navigating toward the commercial district where Apex Elite Fitness was located. As I approached the address, I could see the bright glow of the event from 2 blocks away. Brandon had rented massive outdoor spotlights that were sweeping across the dark night sky, attempting to project an image of massive corporate success. The parking lot was packed with expensive luxury vehicles belonging to the local millionaires and social influencers he was desperately trying to con. I found a parking spot near the very back of the lot and turned off the engine. I sat quietly in the cabin of my car, looking directly at the building. The heavy bass of the club music vibrated through the pavement. I could see the silhouettes of wealthy guests mingling through the large glass windows, holding expensive drinks and laughing at my brother's jokes. They had absolutely no idea that the man pouring their champagne was a desperate fraud standing on legally seized property. I picked up my heavy designer briefcase from the passenger seat. I opened my heavy car door and stepped out onto the cold black asphalt. The cool night air felt electric against my skin. I smoothed the lapels of my tailored blazer, tightened my grip on the briefcase, and began walking directly toward the front entrance of the venue, fully prepared to bring their pathetic charade to a devastating and permanent end. I pushed open the heavy glass doors of the fitness center and stepped into the reception lobby. The space had been transformed for the evening, but to my trained eye, the facade was incredibly thin. The bright fluorescent gym lights had been swapped out for moody violet uplighting, and rented crystal chandeliers hung awkwardly from the exposed, industrial ceiling beams. A local disc jockey was stationed in the far corner playing pulsating lounge music that vibrated intensely through the hardwood floorboards. Waitstaff circulated through the crowd carrying silver trays lined with inexpensive sparkling wine that was being passed off as premium imported champagne. It was a masterclass in superficial glamour, designed to separate gullible people from their capital. I walked past the temporary check-in desk without breaking my stride. The young woman holding the guest list looked up, but the sheer authority radiating from my tailored midnight blue suit stopped her from asking for my name. I simply belonged there. As I moved deeper into the main lobby, the stark contrast between my current appearance and the subdued version of myself I had always presented to my family immediately began to turn heads. For my entire adult life, I had attended our miserable family dinners, wearing oversized sweaters and faded slacks, deliberately making myself visually unremarkable so my brother could easily dominate the room. Now the sharp architectural lines of my designer blazer and the crisp white silk of my blouse commanded absolute attention from everyone. A few local business owners I recognized from my industry research glanced in my direction, nodding with subtle professional respect. They assumed I was a high-level venture capitalist who had come to evaluate the investment. I kept my posture impeccably straight and my expression entirely unreadable. I tightened my firm grip on the structured leather briefcase that held the final foreclosure execution documents. Every single step I took against the polished concrete floor felt like a steady, heavy drumbeat, marking the inevitable end of their fraudulent empire. I scanned the crowded room, looking for the primary targets. It did not take long to find my mother. Barbara was standing near a massive floral arrangement, holding a cocktail glass and animatedly talking to a wealthy real estate developer. She was wearing an overly embellished evening gown that looked out of place in a commercial fitness facility. As I walked past the heavy velvet ropes separating the reception area from the main event space, she turned her head. Her eyes locked onto mine across the crowded room. I watched the polite socialite smile vanish from her face in a fraction of a second. It was instantly replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic. The blood drained entirely from her cheeks, leaving her looking pale, terrified, and incredibly old. She abruptly excused herself from the conversation and began pushing her way through the milling crowd of guests. She moved with frantic, desperate energy, her heels clicking sharply against the floor as she rushed to intercept me before I could reach the center of the room. I stopped walking and waited calmly for her to arrive, planting my feet firmly on the ground I now legally owned. When she finally reached me, she did not offer a normal greeting. She reached out and tightly grabbed my upper arm, her fingernails digging uncomfortably through the fine Italian wool of my sleeve. She attempted to pull me backward, trying to physically drag me out of the main thoroughfare and into a darkened coat closet situated near the guest bathrooms. A month ago, I would have yielded to her aggressive physical pressure. I would have let her pull me into the shadows out of an ingrained habit of submissive obedience to her toxic authority. But tonight, my feet remained absolutely planted. She tugged on my arm again, her face contorting with frustrated anger when she realized I was not moving a single inch. She leaned in close, her expensive floral perfume failing to mask the sour smell of fear radiating from her skin. She hissed at me with absolute venom, demanding to know what on earth I was doing here. She looked me up and down with an expression of pure disgust. She told me I looked ridiculous, playing dress-up in professional corporate clothes I clearly could not afford. Her voice trembled with barely suppressed rage as she continued her vicious, psychological assault. She frantically whispered that I was going to embarrass my brother in front of real investors and high-level executives. She insisted that my mere presence was a massive liability to his crucial expansion plans. She tightened her painful grip on my arm and commanded me to go stand in the dark corner by the coat check and keep my mouth shut for the rest of the evening. She ordered me not to speak to a single person in the room unless I was specifically spoken to first. She told me that if I ruined this incredibly important night for Brandon, she would ensure I was permanently banned from every future family gathering forever. The gaslighting was so predictable it was almost boring to witness. She was standing inside a commercial building that was currently drowning in millions of dollars of defaulted debt, looking directly at a daughter who held the financial keys to her entire existence, and she was still trying to play the role of the dominant, untouchable matriarch. She honestly believed that her harsh words still possessed the power to shatter my confidence. She thought she could simply scold me into submission and force me to shrink back into the convenient, compliant box she had built for me over 3 decades. I looked down at her manicured hand gripping the dark sleeve of my immaculate suit. I felt absolutely no anger and no lingering sense of childhood intimidation. I simply felt a cold, clinical detachment. I was observing a pathetic woman entirely disconnected from the devastating reality of her own catastrophic situation. I raised my free hand and placed my fingers deliberately over her wrist. I did not squeeze or use any unnecessary physical force. I smoothly and methodically peeled her trembling fingers away from my arm, breaking her physical hold with absolute, unyielding finality. Her eyes widened in genuine shock at the quiet, effortless strength of my resistance. I let her hand drop back down to her side. I looked my mother directly in the eyes and offered her a slow, chillingly cold smile. I did not say a single word in response to her frantic, whispered insults. I did not need to defend my wardrobe or justify my presence at this event. The time for arguing with these people had passed weeks ago. I stepped gracefully around her frozen figure, entirely dismissing her continued existence. I adjusted my secure grip on my heavy briefcase and began walking directly toward the glowing entrance of the designated VIP room. The heavy velvet curtains were pulled back, revealing a spacious area where the wealthiest attendees had gathered around a premium open bar. I strode proudly past the private security guard, who stepped aside immediately upon making solid eye contact with me. I moved into the very center of the exclusive space, leaving my mother standing completely alone and terrified in the hallway. The loud music seemed to fade into the background as I surveyed the crowded room, preparing to deliver the massive financial execution they had so eagerly and thoroughly earned. Inside the VIP room, the conversation had the polished rhythm of people accustomed to being listened to. Local developers, franchise owners, physicians, and technology executives stood in small circles beneath the rented chandeliers, holding sparkling wine and exchanging business cards. I recognized several names from commercial loan files and industry conferences, although none of them appeared to recognize me. I accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing server, positioned myself near the edge of the largest group, and listened while Brandon performed the role he had created for himself. He stood in the center of the circle with one hand in his jacket pocket and the other moving theatrically as he described Apex Elite Fitness as a luxury wellness brand in Texas. He claimed waiting lists were forming at the Austin location. He spoke about proprietary training systems, celebrity partnerships, and expansion opportunities in Dallas, Houston, and San Antonio. Every sentence was polished enough to sound plausible to someone who had not reviewed the ledgers. I watched two prospective investors nod while he described revenue that did not exist and membership retention that his own records disproved. Barbara entered the room several steps behind me. She had recovered enough from our confrontation to rebuild her social smile, but her eyes stayed fixed on me with alarm. She positioned herself beside Thomas and whispered urgently into his ear. My father turned, found me among the guests, and immediately stiffened. Neither of them approached. The surrounding investors were too important, and creating another visible scene might damage Brandon's image. They could only watch as I stood calmly in the room they had ordered me to avoid. Brandon followed their line of sight. The moment he saw me, his expression changed. Surprise flickered first, then irritation, and finally the familiar pleasure he always took in finding a public way to diminish me. He excused himself from the investors and crossed the room with a smile. Instead of speaking privately, he raised his voice so everyone nearby could hear. "Well, look who actually showed up," he announced. "My little sister decided to see how the big leagues operate." Several people turned toward us. Brandon looked me up and down, taking in the tailored suit, the silk blouse, and the briefcase. For a second, uncertainty passed through his eyes. My appearance did not fit the story he had told about me. Then he decided the clothes had to be a costume and leaned harder into the performance. "Elise works with spreadsheets," he explained to the group, using the indulgent tone of someone describing a child's hobby. "Very stable, very safe. She likes tiny numbers and predictable little paychecks. Entrepreneurship makes her nervous." A few guests offered restrained smiles. One older developer glanced at me, then at Brandon, clearly uncomfortable with the introduction. Brandon noticed the hesitation and escalated. He placed a hand against his chest as if sharing a funny family secret. "She was living in our parents' backyard guest house until recently," he continued. "Mom and Dad finally asked her to pay $1,500 in rent, and she packed everything into garbage bags because she could not afford it. But I have to give her credit. She still came tonight to learn what a real career looks like." The laugh he expected never arrived. Two people chuckled automatically, then stopped when they saw my expression. A woman who owned a regional chain of medical clinics lowered her glass and studied me with new interest. The real estate developer Barbara had been speaking with earlier shifted his weight and looked toward the exit. Publicly humiliating a sibling over rent was not the sophisticated entrepreneurial story Brandon imagined it to be. I did not defend myself. I did not explain the penthouse, my savings, my title, or the portfolio sitting under my authority. I took a sip of sparkling water and allowed the silence to settle around his joke. My refusal to react made him visibly uneasy. He had built his confidence on the certainty that I would blush, argue, or retreat. Without that response, his cruelty hung in the air without protection. Brandon laughed too loudly and tried again. He told the group that I had always been jealous of people willing to take risks. He repeated the old story about the investor meeting and claimed I had sabotaged him by refusing to lend him my car. He left out his suspended license and the fact that I needed the vehicle for work. He described my departure from the guest house as an emotional breakdown caused by financial instability. Each lie was designed to restore the hierarchy he understood with Brandon, the visionary, Elise, the bitter failure, and our parents, the generous victims. Thomas finally joined us, smiling rigidly. He placed a hand on Brandon's shoulder and assured the investors that his son had always been the ambitious one in the family. Barbara added that some children were born to build legacies while others preferred the security of routine employment. They spoke as though I were not standing directly in front of them. Their coordinated performance was almost identical to the birthday dinner, only now the audience wore tailored suits and carried investment capital. I looked around the circle and noticed the reactions becoming colder. These were people who evaluated character as carefully as projected returns. Brandon believed that reducing me would elevate him, But the contempt he displayed was exposing something the financial presentation could not hide. A man who mocked a family member's housing situation in front of strangers was also a man capable of humiliating employees, misleading partners, and shifting blame when his promises failed. One investor asked me what kind of spreadsheets I worked with. Brandon opened his mouth to answer for me, but I looked directly at the investor and said only that I specialized in commercial real estate risk. My response was calm and technically accurate. The investor's eyebrows lifted slightly. Before he could ask another question, Brandon cut in and laughed that I reviewed boring office leases while he created real businesses. I let him keep talking. Every dismissive sentence made the coming reveal more credible. He returned to his guests and began describing a fictional pipeline of franchise commitments. I moved toward the bar, keeping my glass in one hand and resting the other lightly beside my briefcase. From there, I could see Barbara watching me, Thomas whispering to Brandon and several investors, quietly checking their phones. Perhaps they were researching Apex. Perhaps they were simply reconsidering the man asking for their money. I made no effort to hurry them. The fraud was revealing itself through his own mouth. A member of the event staff approached Brandon and told him the presentation system was ready. His face brightened. He tapped his microphone, adjusted his expensive jacket, and announced that the evening's main investment opportunity was about to begin. He directed the guests toward the stage and promised numbers that would redefine the boutique fitness market. As the crowd moved, he passed close to me and whispered that I should stay silent unless I wanted security to remove me. I smiled and lifted my sparkling water in a small salute. He mistook my composure for surrender. Then he climbed the steps toward the illuminated platform carrying his fabricated charts and preparing to ask the room for $500,000. Behind him, the local disc jockey reached for the controls, ready to bring the music down. The local disc jockey brought the pulsating lounge music to a smooth, deliberate halt, and a bright white spotlight suddenly illuminated the small, elevated stage at the far end of the room. The low murmur of wealthy investors and local business owners quickly settled into an attentive, expectant silence. Brandon stepped confidently into the center of the glaring light, holding a wireless microphone in his right hand. He wore a practiced, charismatic smile that had successfully fooled our parents for decades. He looked out over the crowd of potential victims and began to weave an incredibly elaborate web of absolute financial fiction. He paced back and forth across the stage, passionately claiming that his boutique fitness brand was currently experiencing explosive, unprecedented growth metrics across every single demographic. He boasted about having flawless corporate credit and proudly announced that his business operated with absolutely zero standing debt. He aggressively painted himself as a brilliant visionary who had single-handedly cracked the code to infinite profitability in the boutique fitness sector. I stood quietly near the open bar in the VIP area, listening to him casually commit federal wire fraud in real time. He smoothly transitioned into the core of his presentation, projecting a series of highly fabricated financial charts onto a large screen behind him. He told the captivated audience that he was opening up an incredibly rare opportunity for them to get in on the ground floor of an exclusive statewide expansion. He painted a magnificent picture of massive returns and guaranteed profits, leveraging his fake success to prey on their greed. He finally reached the climax of his polished pitch, leaning forward to create a sense of artificial intimacy with the crowd. He asked the assembled millionaires to write substantial checks tonight to secure their highly coveted spots in his next corporate phase. He was specifically asking for a massive $500,000 initial investment to fuel his completely fabricated empire. He promised them a staggering 30% return on their capital within the very first year of operation. I rested my heavy, structured leather briefcase gently on a high-top cocktail table. I unclasped the polished metal hardware with a sharp, definitive click that felt incredibly loud to my own ears. I reached inside and pulled out the thick, heavy stack of finalized foreclosure documents and commercial eviction notices. The crisp white paper felt solid and reassuring against my fingertips. I did not rush or show any sign of nervous hesitation. I left my empty briefcase sitting on the table and turned to face the main floor. I stepped out from the shadowed periphery of the exclusive VIP section and walked directly into the center aisle, leading straight toward the illuminated stage. The sharp, rhythmic clicking of my elegant stiletto heels echoed clearly against the polished concrete floorboards. As I moved through the center of the crowd, the wealthy attendees instinctively parted to make way for me. My striking midnight blue designer suit and absolute unwavering confidence demanded immediate physical respect from every person in the room. They whispered excitedly to each other as I passed by, marveling at the intense, commanding aura that preceded my every step. They naturally assumed I was a major institutional investor moving forward to present a massive check. I kept my posture impeccably straight, and my gaze locked entirely on the man holding the microphone. I saw the exact moment Brandon registered my presence in the center aisle. His practiced, charismatic smile faltered for a fraction of a second, but he quickly recovered, assuming I was just a bitter sibling trying to awkwardly interrupt his glorious moment of triumph. He gripped the microphone tightly, preparing to deliver his final, forceful call to action before the eager investors could put their checkbooks away into their expensive, tailored pockets. He raised the microphone back to his lips, taking a deep breath to deliver his closing line. He confidently commanded the audience to pull out their pens and write their checks tonight to ensure they did not miss out on the financial opportunity of a lifetime. He never got the chance to finish his carefully rehearsed sentence. I stopped walking when I was approximately 10 feet away from the edge of the elevated stage. I did not need a microphone to make my presence known. I drew in a deep breath and let my voice ring out, sharp, cold, and carrying with absolute piercing clarity through the silent, expectant room. I announced to the entire crowd that before a single person in this building wrote a check tonight, we desperately needed to discuss the $1.2 million in severely defaulted commercial debt. The words hit the room like a physical shockwave. A collective gasp rippled through the audience of wealthy business owners. Dozens of heads whipped around to stare at me, trying to process the catastrophic financial numbers I had just casually dropped into the dead silence. Brandon completely froze on the stage. The arrogant smirk vanished from his face, leaving behind a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. He lowered the microphone slowly, his eyes wide and panicked as he stared down at the thick stack of official corporate paperwork grasped firmly in my hand. The entire manufactured illusion of his booming enterprise was instantly suspended in the cold, heavy air. The wealthy investors exchanged worried glances, murmuring quietly among themselves as the brutal reality of my statement began to sink in. They were seasoned businessmen, and they immediately recognized the unmistakable tone of a serious corporate executive exposing a major financial liability. The atmosphere shifted from eager anticipation to absolute profound caution in a matter of seconds. The sudden, devastating interruption completely shattered the polished atmosphere of the high-end networking event. From the front row, my father sprang to his feet. Thomas had been sitting proudly among the potential investors, basking in the reflected glory of his golden child. He had spent the entire evening bragging to his peers about Brandon's incredible entrepreneurial vision and unstoppable ambition. His face was turning a volatile shade of bright red. He realized that his carefully curated family image was being publicly dismantled, and his immediate reaction was pure aggressive hostility. He abandoned all social decorum and rushed toward the front of the stage, positioning his body between me and his precious son. He pointed a trembling, furious finger directly at my face. He screamed furiously, ordering me out of the building immediately. He lost all control of his temper, ignoring the horrified stares of the millionaires who were watching the chaotic scene unfold. He shouted that I was a deeply jealous, bitter failure who was desperately trying to ruin a successful business venture out of petty spite. He sneered with absolute disgust and proudly declared to the entire room that I was just a low-level desk worker who did not know the first thing about high-level corporate finance. He demanded the private security guards come and physically remove me from the premises so his son could finish securing his hard-earned investment capital. He told everyone I was an unhinged individual trying to steal the spotlight from my talented older brother. He stood there puffing his chest out, trying to use his parental authority to silence me like he had done for my entire life. But this was not our dining room table, and I was not the terrified little girl he was so accustomed to bullying. He was completely powerless. I ignored my father's demand for security and kept my attention on the stage. Thomas was still pointing at me, still trying to reduce me to the obedient daughter he remembered, but the room had already stopped accepting his version of reality. No guard moved, no investor asked me to leave. Brandon stood beneath the spotlight with the microphone hanging at his side, his face pale and rigid. I walked forward until I reached the steps, then climbed onto the platform without asking permission. Brandon finally found his voice. He told me through clenched teeth to get off his stage. I stopped directly in front of him and held out my hand for the microphone. He stared at me as though the request itself were impossible. Behind him, the presentation screen still displayed a fabricated graph showing explosive revenue growth. I glanced at the chart, then back at him. When he refused to release the microphone, I closed my fingers around it and removed it from his shaking hand with one controlled motion. He did not resist. The authority he had performed all evening disappeared the moment someone confronted him with verified facts. I turned to face the investors. The spotlight was hot against my skin, but my voice remained clear and even. "My name is Elise," I said. "I am the senior commercial real estate underwriter responsible for the distressed debt portfolio recently acquired by Vanguard Equity." The name of the firm changed the atmosphere instantly. Several people in the audience recognized it. Vanguard Equity was not a local lender Brandon could charm or delay. It was a private equity company known for buying troubled debt, enforcing contracts, and recovering value from failed commercial assets. The developer in the front row straightened. The woman who had asked about my spreadsheets looked from me to the legal documents in my hand and understood why I had not defended myself earlier. As of 48 hours ago, I continued, Vanguard Equity holds title to this commercial property and controls the note on Apex Elite Fitness. The right to cure period expired without payment, without a restructuring request, and without any response from the borrower. The final transfer was recorded Friday afternoon. I looked directly at Brandon. "You are not hosting this gala in your building. You are occupying an asset owned by my firm." A sharp murmur moved through the crowd. Brandon stepped toward me, but I lifted the first page of the foreclosure confirmation where the official seal was visible. He stopped. His eyes moved across the document, searching for an error he could attack. There was none. "The outstanding defaulted obligation is approximately $1.2 million, I said. "Apex Elite Fitness is 120 days delinquent on its primary commercial debt. It has not generated a true operating profit in 24 months. The company has survived through extensions, high-interest borrowing, and repeated capital injections from personal guarantors." Brandon shook his head violently and tried to tell the audience I was twisting the numbers. I turned toward the screen and pointed to his projected growth chart. "The revenue shown behind me is not supported by the bank records. Promotional memberships were counted as recurring customers. Cancellations were excluded from retention calculations. Personal transfers were presented as operating revenue. Vendor obligations, late payroll, and unpaid facility expenses were omitted from the figures you were shown tonight." Someone near the back swore under his breath. Two investors pulled out their phones and began photographing the screen and the documents. Brandon reached for the microphone, but I stepped away from him and continued. This is not simply a business that experienced a slow quarter. Funds were diverted from operating accounts and falsely categorized as marketing executive outreach and client acquisition. A federally backed small business administration loan intended for payroll and essential business expenses was used to support personal luxury spending. I opened the file to the highlighted transaction summary. $2,000 per month for a Porsche lease was labeled a mobile marketing asset. More than $15,000 in first-class travel and luxury accommodations in Cabo San Lucas was recorded as client acquisition drifts. Repeated $1,000 steakhouse charges were listed as investor networking expenses. Transfers moved from the business into accounts controlled personally by Brandon, while employees, vendors, insurers, and lenders remained unpaid. The room reacted with open disgust. The investors who had appeared interested minutes earlier were no longer looking at Brandon as a visionary. They were looking at him as a liability. His practiced smile had vanished. Sweat gathered along his hairline despite the cool air. Barbara pushed toward the stage and shouted that every successful chief executive used vehicles and dinners for business. I turned my gaze toward her. Legitimate expenses require legitimate business purposes and documentation, I said. These transactions had neither. Then I lifted a second document. There is one more fact the guarantors deserve to hear publicly because they chose to promote this investment publicly. Thomas and Barbara pledged their primary residence as additional collateral for Apex Elite Fitness. They refinanced that property 3 times and transferred the proceeds into this company. The commercial default triggered the residential lien. Vanguard Equity now holds the controlling claim on their home. For the first time that night, my mother became completely silent. Her mouth remained open, but no sound came out. Thomas turned toward Brandon with an expression I had never seen before. It was not pride anger at me or protective loyalty. It was dawning fear. He looked at his son as though he were finally seeing the cost attached to every excuse he had accepted. Brandon whispered that I could not do this to family. I lowered the microphone slightly. I did not create these debts, I told him. I did not sign these guarantees. I did not divert the loan proceeds. I reviewed the file your decisions created. He insisted that the regional bank had always granted him more time. I explained that the regional bank no longer owned the debt and that every required notice had been delivered. The 30-day cure period had passed. The ownership transfer had been recorded. The eviction order was final. There was no remaining extension for him to negotiate at the gala, and no investor check written that evening could erase the fraud already documented. The contrast between his expansion chart and the foreclosure pages was obscene. One image represented the fantasy he sold to strangers. The other represented the contract's payments, signatures, and missing money that charisma could not ever erase. I handed the microphone back to him, but his fingers failed to close around it. It slipped against his palm, and I caught it before it struck the floor. I placed it carefully on the podium. Then I stepped close enough that only the people nearest the stage could hear my final words. You invited me here to see what a real career looks like, I said. This is what mine looks like when the numbers stop protecting your lies. I turned toward the audience and raised the completed foreclosure and eviction package so the official seals were visible. Then I faced Brandon one last time and dropped the thick file directly against his chest. He grabbed for it too late. The folder burst open, sending notices, ledgers, payment histories, and property transfer documents across the illuminated stage. White pages slid around his polished shoes, each one carrying a piece of the truth he had spent years hiding. For several seconds, nobody moved. The documents settled across the stage, while Brandon stood in the middle of them, staring down at the evidence as though the pages had appeared from nowhere. Then the investors began reacting. The real estate developer in the front row bent to pick up one of the foreclosure notices. He read the first paragraph, saw the official filing information, and handed it to the attorney beside him. The attorney scanned the seals, the property description, and the recorded date. His expression hardened. He whispered something to the developer, who turned toward the exit. That single decision broke the paralysis holding the room. Other guests stepped away from the stage and reached for coats, phones, and briefcases. A physician who had been discussing a six-figure investment told his advisor to cancel the transfer they had planned for Monday. Two franchise operators exchanged furious looks and walked out together. The woman who owned the medical clinics stopped beside me long enough to say that she appreciated the warning, then joined the growing stream moving toward the lobby. No one asked Brandon for a revised explanation. No one offered him more time. Investors understood that false financial statements diverted government-backed funds, and a finalized foreclosure were not temporary obstacles. They were reasons to leave immediately. Within moments, the gala became a mass exodus. The wealthy guests who had arrived in luxury vehicles and accepted champagne under Brandon's rented lights now moved through the velvet ropes, eager to distance themselves from the appearance of complicity. They photographed the legal pages before leaving. Others called attorneys while walking. The excited conversations about franchise territories and projected returns were replaced by clipped warnings about preserving emails and documenting promises. Brandon's supposed investors had transformed into potential witnesses. The disc jockey watched the room empty and reached for his controls. The music stopped in the middle of a beat. Without the pulsing bass, the building felt hollow. Event staff froze beside trays of untouched drinks. The bartender began packing bottles. The rented chandeliers continued glowing above a room that no longer contained an audience for the illusion. The only sounds were the heavy doors opening, expensive shoes striking the lobby floor, and Barbara's breathing becoming faster as she watched everything collapse. Then, my mother screamed. She rushed toward the departing guests, insisting that the documents were forged and that I had fabricated the entire story because I was jealous of my brother. She grabbed at sleeves, begged people to stay, and promised that Brandon could explain every transaction. Nobody stopped. Her voice rose higher as each person ignored her. She shouted that I had always resented Brandon's ambition, that I was emotionally unstable, and that Vanguard Equity would reverse everything once its real executives learned what I had done. The more she spoke, the more desperate and unbelievable she sounded. Thomas tried a different tactic. He climbed onto the stage and began gathering papers telling the guests that the family was experiencing a private misunderstanding. He said the debt was a routine refinancing matter and accused me of violating confidentiality. An attorney near the exit replied that recorded foreclosure documents were not a private misunderstanding. My father had no answer. He looked down at the official pages in his hands and saw that anger could not change a filing date. Brandon dropped to his knees among the scattered documents. He pulled the eviction notice close to his face, then grabbed the payment ledger and flipped through it with shaking fingers. His lips moved as he read the outstanding balance, the default interest, and the description of the seized commercial property. He found the transaction schedule, showing the Porsche Cabo travel and restaurant charges. He looked toward me with panic, asking how I had obtained records he believed were buried inside his accounts. The color drained from his face when he reached the page confirming that the transfer had already been recorded. "This is final," he whispered. It was the first truthful statement he had made all evening. Barbara heard him and stopped shouting at the doors. She turned back toward the stage, her expression shifting from denial to terror. She demanded that he tell her the house was safe. Brandon did not answer. Thomas held up the residential collateral schedule and stared at his son. He asked where the money had gone. He asked why the vendors were unpaid. He asked whether the Cabo trips had really been business. Brandon tried to say that appearances were necessary to attract investors, but even he no longer sounded convinced. For the first time, my parents directed their disbelief toward the child they had always protected. It brought me no satisfaction. Their questions were years too late. They had ignored every warning because believing Brandon allowed them to preserve the hierarchy they preferred. Now the hierarchy was collapsing under the weight of documents they had signed and money they had surrendered. I stepped down from the stage. My purpose had been completed. I had not come to argue, negotiate, or watch them punish one another. I had delivered the foreclosure package and prevented innocent investors from funding a fraud. As I crossed the empty floor, Thomas rushed after me. He caught my shoulder and spun me around. His face was wet with sweat, and the authority in his voice had been replaced by panic. "You work for them," he said. "You can stop this." He demanded that I call the managing director, cancel the filing, restore Brandon's ownership, and remove the lien from their house. He insisted that I owed them because they were my parents. Barbara hurried over and repeated that family protected family. Brandon remained on his knees but began promising that he could repay everything if I gave him another 6 months. Their voices overlapped, each of them treating my position as one more family resource they had the right to seize. I removed my father's hand from my shoulder and let it fall to his side. I looked at all three of them. The birthday dinner returned to me with clarity: the printed contract, the cold pasta, the Rolex, and the order to pack my bags. They had shown no hesitation when they believed I was powerless. Now, they wanted compassion only because power had changed hands. "I did fix it," I said. Thomas blinked. "I reviewed a terminal account, documented the fraud, and liquidated a bad asset." Barbara recoiled as though I had struck her. Brandon told me that Apex was his legacy. I looked around the emptied building, at the abandoned glasses, the dark sound system, and the foreclosure pages covering the stage. "No," I said. "This is your legacy." I turned away before they could begin another demand. My heels echoed through the silent lobby as I walked toward the front doors. No one tried to stop me again. Outside, the air cleared the last trace of the rented perfume and stale champagne from my lungs. Behind me, Barbara started crying. Thomas began shouting at Brandon, and my brother pleaded that he could explain. Their voices faded when the glass doors closed. I crossed the parking lot without looking back. The locks would be changed Monday morning, the commercial staff would be removed, the residential seizure notice would be delivered, and the creditors Brandon had manipulated would begin reclaiming whatever remained. The gala had destroyed the illusion in public. The coming work week would enforce the consequences in law. Monday morning arrived with the sharp, crisp efficiency of a standard corporate work week. At exactly 8 o'clock, the physical gears of the Vanguard Equity Asset Recovery Division began to turn. I sat at my desk with a hot cup of black coffee, watching the live updates populate on my secure terminal. Our contracted security team arrived at the commercial property housing Apex Elite Fitness precisely on schedule. According to the field report, my brother was already inside the building, attempting to rally his few remaining trainers after the disastrous weekend. The lead security contractor, a former military officer who handled our high-risk commercial evictions, walked straight through the front doors. He did not engage in any arguments or listen to any of Brandon's desperate, charismatic excuses. He simply handed over the finalized court order, demanding the immediate vacation of the premises. The contractors moved efficiently through the building, systematically replacing the cylinders on every single exterior door. Brandon was given exactly 15 minutes to gather his personal belongings. The security team escorted him out of the facility, forcing him to walk through the parking lot, carrying a cardboard box of protein powder and branded gym towels. His remaining staff members were locked out alongside him, watching in stunned silence as the heavy glass doors were permanently chained shut from the inside. The execution of the commercial foreclosure was only the first domino to fall. The cross-collateralization clause that I had meticulously verified meant that the default automatically triggered the secondary property seizure. At 10 o'clock that same morning, a local county sheriff deputy pulled into the long manicured driveway of my parents' suburban home. He walked up the brick pathway past my mother's prized rose bushes and knocked heavily on the custom oak front door. Thomas answered the door, still wearing his bathrobe. The deputy handed him a thick manila envelope containing the formal notice of residential seizure. Because the house was inextricably tied to the commercial debt, my parents were completely stripped of their ownership rights. The legal documents clearly stated that Vanguard Equity now possessed the deed to the property. They were granted a strict 30-day window to completely vacate the sprawling colonial house they had spent decades bragging about to their friends and neighbors. There would be no negotiations and no lengthy appeals process. They had gambled their entire financial security on my brother's fraudulent enterprise, and the house always wins. While my parents were staring in absolute horror at their residential eviction notice, the situation for Brandon was rapidly deteriorating from a civil matter into a severe criminal crisis. The massive stack of financial ledgers I had dumped onto the stage at the gala contained undeniable proof of federal wire fraud and the blatant misuse of government-backed loans. The sudden, loud exposure of his embezzlement acted like a flare to financial regulators. By Tuesday morning, the federal agencies overseeing the Small Business Administration loans had officially flagged his accounts for investigation. But the immediate physical consequences arrived long before the federal auditors. The various predatory lenders and secondary creditors Brandon had been stringing along caught wind of the commercial foreclosure. They moved swiftly to reclaim whatever physical assets they could find. On Wednesday afternoon, I received a notification that the recovery agents had located his luxury vehicles. 2 heavy-duty tow trucks pulled into his upscale residential neighborhood in broad daylight. Brandon ran out of his house, waving his arms and shouting at the repo men, but they completely ignored him. They quickly hoisted his brand-new Porsche onto the flatbed, securing the expensive tires with heavy yellow straps. The second truck backed up and hooked onto his heavily financed luxury sports utility vehicle. The entire spectacle took place right in front of his wealthy neighbors, who stood on their manicured lawns watching the undeniable collapse of his fake entrepreneurial lifestyle. He had spent years looking down on people who drove sensible cars and worked regular jobs. Now he was standing on the sidewalk watching his entire fabricated identity being hauled away down the street. The humiliation was absolute and entirely public. I monitored these developments from the quiet sanctuary of my downtown office, feeling a deep sense of profound closure. I had not actively orchestrated the repossession of his cars or the federal investigation into his loans. I had simply removed the artificial safety net my parents had built for him and allowed the crushing weight of reality to finally crash down on his shoulders. The protective bubble they had maintained at my expense was completely shattered. They were now facing the terrifying prospect of true financial ruin, with absolutely nowhere to turn and no one left to exploit. The sheer desperation of their situation quickly mutated into a frantic, unhinged scramble for survival. My mother realized with sickening clarity that the massive corporate entities systematically destroying their lives was the very same company that employed the daughter she had so callously discarded. By Thursday afternoon, my cellular phone indicated a massive surge in blocked incoming calls. Barbara was desperately trying to breach the digital wall I had erected between us. She called my number dozens of times, leaving frantic, rambling voicemails that my carrier automatically filtered into a separate hidden folder. She shifted from demanding that I answer my phone to begging for a 5-minute conversation to crying hysterically about the prospect of moving into a tiny apartment. I did not listen to a single one of her messages. I had spent my entire life listening to her demands and absorbing her criticisms. I owed her absolutely zero of my time or my emotional energy. When the digital harassment failed to elicit any response, my mother resorted to the only option she felt she had left. She began calling extended family members, desperately trying to track down my new physical address. She manipulated my younger cousins, feeding them a fabricated story about a terrible family emergency and a desperate need to deliver important medical documents. Her relentless pressure eventually broke through the ranks. Someone in the family network who had previously seen my new residential building in the background of a generic skyline photograph I had once sent provided her with the general location of my downtown high-rise. She did not know my exact apartment number, but she knew the building name and the corporate address of Vanguard Equity. Her absolute desperation overrode any lingering sense of social decorum or personal dignity. She realized that she could not manipulate the faceless executives at the private equity firm, but she firmly believed she could still manipulate her daughter. She convinced herself that if she could just get me in a room and apply the right amount of maternal guilt, she could force me to use my high-level corporate influence to reverse the foreclosures and bail them out one last time. She formulated a plan to ambush me outside the protective walls of my office. She parked her car near the towering glass structure of my residential building, determined to hunt me down and demand a financial pardon. She was entirely bankrupt out of options and running purely on the toxic delusion that family loyalty could somehow override a federal corporate seizure. She was pacing the pavement, waiting for me to step into her trap. She watched the heavy revolving glass doors, intently plotting her next desperate, manipulative, and entirely futile emotional attack against me. Then she stepped inside the expansive marble lobby of my residential building, just as a large group of catering staff exited through the side service doors. She bypassed the sophisticated biometric security measures and the attentive front desk staff by slipping through the brief gap in the physical barrier. I arrived home from the Vanguard Equity offices shortly after 6 o'clock in the evening, feeling deeply satisfied with another highly productive day. I walked through the heavy revolving glass doors, carrying my structured leather briefcase, and anticipating a quiet, relaxing night in my private penthouse. The soaring ceilings and polished stone floors of the lobby usually brought me a profound sense of peace and absolute security. But as I moved toward the private elevators, the atmosphere in the elegant space suddenly shattered. Barbara stepped out from behind a massive, decorative marble pillar directly into my path. The sheer physical transformation of my mother was genuinely shocking to witness. The impeccably groomed, arrogant matriarch who had cornered me at the fitness center gala was completely gone. In her place stood a deeply haggard, terrified older woman, wearing wrinkled clothes and sporting severely disheveled hair. Her eyes were red-rimmed and heavily swollen from days of relentless crying. She looked utterly defeated by the catastrophic weight of the legal and financial reality crushing down on her shoulders. She lunged toward me with a frantic, uncoordinated energy. The building concierge immediately stood up from his desk, his hand hovering over the security alert button, but I raised my hand slightly to signal that I had the situation under control. I did not want the police involved. I wanted to handle this final, pathetic display of parental manipulation on my own terms. Barbara grabbed the sleeve of my designer blazer with trembling, desperate fingers. Her voice echoed loudly against the polished stone walls as she began to weep hysterically right in the middle of the luxurious public space. She begged me to listen to her pleading for just 5 minutes of my time. She cried that she had nowhere else to turn and that I was the absolute only person in the world who could stop the terrifying avalanche of corporate foreclosures destroying their lives. She completely abandoned the toxic, haughty demeanor she had wielded like a weapon for my entire life, and resorted to pure, unfiltered begging. She demanded that I use my high-level executive influence at the private equity firm to reverse the property seizures. She shrieked that we were a family and that family is supposed to protect each other during times of terrible crisis. She tightened her grip on my arm and sobbed heavily. She wailed that my father was having chest pains from the overwhelming stress and that Brandon was facing serious federal investigations. She cried that the bank had given them 30 days to vacate their home, and they were being forced to move into a tiny, cramped two-bedroom apartment on the undesirable side of town. She looked up at me with tears streaming down her pale face and begged me to fix this disaster. She insisted that I had the corporate power to make the nightmare go away, and that I owed it to the people who had raised me to intervene. She practically collapsed against me, crying that family helps family, and that I could not simply stand by and watch them lose every single thing they had worked so hard to build. Her desperate emotional performance was designed to evoke a profound sense of overwhelming guilt and immediate filial duty. She was utilizing the exact same psychological manipulation tactics she had used to control me since I was a child, fully expecting me to finally break under the intense pressure of her public suffering. I stood perfectly still in the center of the glittering lobby. I did not pull my arm away from her grasping hands. I did not raise my voice to match her frantic volume. I did not look around to see if the other wealthy residents were watching the embarrassing spectacle unfold. I simply looked down at my weeping mother with a sense of absolute coldness and profound, unwavering detachment. A few weeks ago, the sight of her crying in such complete despair might have triggered a deeply ingrained response to comfort her and resolve her problems. But looking at her now, I felt absolutely zero pity for the woman weeping on the marble floor. I looked at her and remembered the cold, calculated extortion she had attempted at my birthday dinner. I remembered how eagerly she had demanded that I hand over $1,500 a month to fund a massive, fraudulent lie. I remembered the vicious family-wide smear campaign she had orchestrated the moment I refused to be her convenient financial victim. I realized that she was not crying because she felt remorse for her terrible behavior. She was only crying because she had finally run out of other people's money to steal. Her tears were nothing more than the bitter byproduct of her own catastrophic arrogance colliding with unavoidable consequences. I felt completely and utterly detached from her suffering. The emotional cord that had bound me to her toxic approval had been permanently severed the night I packed my belongings into garbage bags and drove away from their guest house. She continued to sob, grasping desperately at my tailored clothing and repeating the exact same tired, predictable phrases about unconditional familial loyalty and necessary forgiveness. She thought she could simply cash in on a biological relationship she had spent decades actively destroying. I took a deep, slow, steadying breath to calm myself and looked directly into her terrified, heavily swollen eyes. I prepared to deliver the final, devastating truth she so desperately needed to hear. I was fully ready to throw her own vicious, calculating words right back in her face and permanently end this completely miserable dynamic once and for all, before leaving her behind forever. I looked down at the woman who had spent my entire life making me feel incredibly small and insignificant. She was still gasping for air, still waiting for me to suddenly cave under the immense pressure of her fabricated tears. I did not blink. I kept my voice incredibly steady and pitched low enough that only she could hear the absolute finality in my tone. I told her that she had raised my rent to $1,500 to intentionally fund a massive corporate fraud. I reminded her that she had maliciously smeared my name to our entire extended family without a single second of hesitation. I watched her eyes widen as I repeated the exact cruel phrasing she had used against me for decades. I reminded her that she had looked me in the eyes and told me that failures simply do not belong in our family. I took a deliberate step back, breaking the physical proximity she was trying to force upon me. I told her with chilling clarity that she was absolutely right. Failures do not belong in this family. I told her they never did. I turned my back on my weeping mother, without waiting to see the devastating impact of my words register on her tear-stained face. I walked purposefully toward the sleek stainless steel doors of my private residential elevator. I pulled my secure keycard from my pocket and tapped it against the glowing biometric reader. The heavy doors slid open with a soft mechanical chime. I stepped inside the immaculate cabin and turned around to face the lobby one last time. Barbara was still standing exactly where I had left her, sobbing into her hands, while the building concierge finally moved forward to escort her off the private premises. The elevator doors smoothly closed together, completely shutting her out of my vision and my life. The following week arrived with a profound sense of absolute structural clarity. The chaotic noise of my former family had been entirely muted and permanently replaced by the highly functional and deeply satisfying rhythm of my demanding corporate career. I walked into the Vanguard equity offices on Monday morning, feeling a distinct shift in the professional atmosphere. The massive liquidation of the distressed regional bank portfolio had been a staggering financial success for our firm. I had successfully and meticulously managed the entire complicated process without a single legal vulnerability or minor administrative delay. The commercial assets we had acquired for pennies on the dollar were already being successfully restructured or aggressively liquidated for massive corporate profits. At exactly 10 in the morning, the managing director called me directly into the main executive boardroom for a scheduled meeting. He did not drop a stack of problematic files on the table this time. He was joined by the senior partners of the private equity firm. They had spent the entire weekend reviewing my comprehensive performance metrics and the flawless execution of the highly volatile debt portfolio. The managing director commended my absolute emotional detachment and my ruthless efficiency in dealing with terminal commercial accounts. He specifically praised my ability to navigate the complex cross-collateralization clauses that had allowed the firm to acquire millions of dollars in secondary residential assets. They were completely unaware that one of those liquidated residential assets was the very house I had grown up in. To them, I was simply a brilliant analytical machine who prioritized the corporate bottom line above all other considerations. The partners stood up from their leather chairs and formally offered me a massive executive promotion. I was officially named the new Vice President of Underwriting for Vanguard Equity. The title came with a staggering compensation package, comprehensive executive benefits, and absolute authority over my own division. I accepted the massive promotion with a highly confident professional handshake. I returned to my corner office and spent the remainder of the afternoon smoothly transitioning into my powerful new corporate role. When the business day finally concluded, I drove my pristine car back to my high-security downtown residential building. I rode the private high-speed elevator all the way up to my luxurious penthouse and walked directly out onto the expansive, polished glass balcony. The warm, soothing evening wind gently washed over me as I stood there quietly, looking out over the beautifully glittering Austin skyline. The vast city lights stretched out endlessly toward the dark, quiet horizon, representing infinite professional possibilities and absolute, permanent, personal freedom. I slowly pulled my sleek cellular phone from my pocket and immediately opened the main settings application. I had spent the last several days systematically blocking every single phone number, email address, and social media account connected to my parents, my brother, and the extended relatives who had participated in the vicious smear campaign. I executed the final digital blocks, cementing my total legal and emotional severance from their deeply toxic reality. They were currently navigating the brutal, unforgiving landscape of public bankruptcy, residential eviction, and federal criminal investigations. They were entirely consumed by the catastrophic consequences of their own arrogant actions, while I was completely insulated from their predictable downfall. For over 3 decades, I had lived in the cold, suffocating shadows of their blatant favoritism. I had quietly built my immense financial success in the dark, while they loudly mocked my practical lifestyle and dismissed my profound intelligence. They had arrogantly chosen to gamble their entire existence on a manufactured illusion of wealth. and they had ultimately lost everything they valued. I slowly put my phone away safely and leaned forward against the smooth glass railing of my private balcony. The heavy, suffocating burden of trying to earn their impossible, conditional love was permanently gone. I had successfully navigated the most challenging and painful transition of my adult life. I stepped fully into the bright, illuminating light of my actual reality. I was incredibly wealthy, deeply respected in my challenging industry, and completely free to live exactly as I desired. Looking back on everything that happened, I realized that the greatest lesson was learning to define my own worth. For years, I allowed my family to treat me as a disposable resource because I believed that biological ties required absolute loyalty. I thought that if I just stayed quiet and worked hard, they would eventually respect me. But toxic people do not change when you give them more of yourself. They simply take until there is nothing left. True security does not come from trying to please people who are committed to exploiting you. It comes from building your own financial foundation and having the profound courage to walk away when your boundaries are threatened. I had to completely lose the illusion of a supportive family to gain the reality of my own total independence. Sometimes the absolute best thing you can do for yourself is to step aside and let the people who hurt you face the devastating consequences of their own terrible choices. You do not owe your success to the people who mocked your struggle. If you have ever had to make the incredibly difficult choice to walk away from a toxic family to protect your own peace, I would love to hear your journey. Please share your experiences in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories about finding your strength and reclaiming your life. Thank you for listening, and remember that your future belongs entirely